The Japanese POW laughed. Not loudly, just a dry, under-the-breath kind of laugh as she watched a cowboy wrestle with a rusty gate on a sunburned cattle ranch somewhere in Texas. The hinges squeaked. The latch didn't catch. A bale of hay toppled from a wagon and scattered across the yard like an accident looking for a reason. She muttered in Japanese to the woman beside her, "So this is American civilization?" He wore a hat with a hole in it, spit into the dirt like a cartoon, mumbled instructions to a horse. She had been trained to expect brutality, maybe violence. But this was disorganized, dirty, and laughably primitive. That was the moment she stopped fearing her captors and started mocking them. But over the next weeks, what she saw behind those crooked fences would unravel everything she thought she knew, not just about Americans, but about control, about power, about how efficiency didn't always wear a uniform. The sun hit her face like a slap as she stepped off the back of the army truck. A gust of dust lifted from the dirt road and spiraled around her legs, coating her boots and the hem of her worn uniform. All around her, the landscape lay flat and endless, dry grass shimmering in waves, fences that leaned like they were tired of standing, and buildings that looked pieced together from scraps and prayers. It did not look like a prison. It barely looked like civilization. She narrowed her eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and muttered in Japanese, "So this is where they keep us?" One of the other women gave a nervous smile. Another just kept her head down. But the former officer Miyako stood upright, watching the gate swing unevenly in the wind. It creaked like a complaint. A cowboy tied it shut with a rope instead of fixing the latch. She snorted softly. Backwards! She was in her mid-30s, with sharp features hardened further by war. Back in Japan, she had been responsible for organizing medical supply routes in the chaos of the home islands, bandages, morphine, iodine. Rice rations she had tracked every gram with a precision, learned under threat of death. Her signature carried weight. Her clipboard was an extension of her authority. But now that clipboard was gone, and she was here, at what appeared to be a cattle ranch disguised as a prison camp. The guards were not what she expected either. No barking commands, no polished boots, just slouching postures, rolled-up sleeves, and lazy drawls. One of them, a tall man with a crooked smile and a hat more whole than fabric, nodded to her like she was a neighbor, not an enemy. He carried his rifle like an afterthought. Another one strolled by chewing a toothpick, pausing only to tip his hat before moving on to yell at a mule stuck behind a water trough. Miyako glanced at the other women. No one seemed to know how to react. This wasn't the cruelty they had been warned about. This was something much stranger. Casualness. The heat pressed down on them like a weight. Flies buzzed. Somewhere, a radio played a tune that had no place in a prison. A cowboy was trying to back a wagon up to the barn and failing miserably. The wheels kicked sideways. Hay toppled. He scratched his head, turned the horse around, and tried again. Miyako watched the entire performance with clinical detachment. If this were her unit, the man would be written up, reassigned, possibly punished. Here, another cowboy ambled over, chuckled, and lent a hand. No one seemed angry. No one seemed afraid. They just corrected course. She found it maddening. As they were led toward the main bunkhouse, a group of men leaned against the fence, chatting like this was an ordinary workday. One offered a canteen. Another pointed at her boots and said something unintelligible, grinning all the while. She ignored them. They weren't threatening. They were barely serious. And yet, this lack of threat felt disorienting in its own way. If they weren't monsters, what were they? A whistle blew short, shrill, not urgent. A few women flinched out of habit. Miyako did not. She turned to see a short, sunburned man waving a clipboard that had clearly seen better days. "Chow at 1700, he said in English, then added slowly, "Food, dinner. You come," he mimed, eating. She blinked. So this was their idea of communication? Of authority? She gave the faintest nod, more out of curiosity than obedience. They were shown to their quarters, an old bunkhouse with peeling paint and patched windows. Inside, rows of cots were lined with wool blankets and metal lockers. A fan turned lazily overhead. A chicken darted out from under one of the beds. One of the women gasped. The cowboy escorting them just laughed. "She lays blue eggs. You'll like 'em." Miyako sat on her cot, not touching anything. Her eyes swept the room like a general surveying an unfamiliar battlefield. She counted beds, exits, shadows. Everything felt haphazard. Every nail was crooked. Every tool mismatched. It should have made her feel superior, but instead, a strange unease settled into her bones. She had expected to fight humiliation, cruelty, maybe starvation. She had rehearsed for brutality, but she had not prepared for this. And outside, the gate still wouldn't latch. Miyako had latched gates before. Not farm gates. Not the kind that hung on rusted hinges and needed a rock to stay shut, but warehouse doors in Nagoya, tarped rail cars packed with gauze and quinine, wooden crates sealed with wax and stamped with imperial markings. She knew how to close things tightly, how to keep them in order. Order had been her job, her pride, her shield. She had not begun as an officer. When the war escalated, she was a typist. 22, soft-spoken, efficient. She filed requisitions for surgical blades, tagged morphine shipments bound for field hospitals in Manchuria, counted rations into bundles with the same precision she once applied to calligraphy. But numbers moved faster than soldiers. Supply lines grew tangled, and as bombs fell and men vanished, she rose not by politics, not by favor, but by her ability to keep the wheels from locking. By 26, she ran an entire logistics corridor from Osaka to Shizuoka. Her reports were flawless, her routes unbroken. She delivered medical crates into cities still burning, sometimes days ahead of schedule. She did not shoot a gun. She never saw the front, but she fought chaos like it was a living enemy. Her war was fought with ink, rope, and ledger paper, and there was honor in that. Back home, she had been taught that obedience was sacred, that precision was devotion. Every late shipment was a shameful mark, every miscount a personal failure. The Empire did not tolerate mistakes, not in battle, not in bureaucracy. They called it Chugi loyalty, not just to the Emperor, but to one's role, one's duty. If a truck arrived 5 minutes late, she did not blame the driver. She blamed herself for not planning better. Her supervisor once told her, "Your pen is a blade. Use it without mercy." So she did. She once had a junior clerk who miscounted the bandages on a coastal delivery. It cost nothing. No one died. But Miyako removed her from her post within an hour. "Mistakes spread like mold," she had written in the dismissal form. The girl cried. Miyako never apologized. Now, standing in a heat wave on a ranch surrounded by horses and tobacco spit, that same woman watched a soldier balance an armful of food trays like a circus act and nearly trip over a chicken. No one yelled. No one corrected him. The tray spilled slightly, but the soldier just chuckled, wiped it off, and moved on. She couldn't believe it. Not the mess, but the indifference to it. They handed out meals without rosters, assigned chores with a shrug. There were no drills, no inspections. When they walked from the barracks to the latrine, No one counted heads. Her skin crawled at the disorder. If she had run this place, there would be schedules, silence, and salutes. And yet, the food was hot. The lines were short. Somehow, it worked. That was the part she could not forgive. How could it function without hierarchy, without ritual? She searched for the spine of the system and found only gestures half-spoken, instructions, habits passed like jokes. There was no commander barking from a tower, no charts pinned to the wall, just quiet repetition. The cowboy from earlier, the one with the frayed hat, she saw him fixing the fence that afternoon, humming to himself, hammering nails into sun-bleached wood. No order had been given. He just noticed the problem and solved it. Miyako had never been allowed to act without instruction. Even her brilliant rerouting of a ruptured supply corridor had required stamped permission, 3 levels of it. She had waited 36 hours for clearance while men died in tents. Here, problems were seen and answered in real time. Like reflex. It was chaotic. It was undisciplined. It was efficient. She shut the thought down like a traitorous signal. No, this was sloppy, disorganized, dangerous. She would not be seduced by it. The Americans were indulgent, wasteful. They let chickens wander indoors. They let dust gather in corners. Their boots were scuffed and their forms half-filled. Her commanders would have called them weak, and yet they did not look over their shoulders. They did not fear punishment. They did not live by shame. Miyako lay in her bunk that night, staring at the ceiling fan, turning in uneven circles, and tried to recite inventory tables in her mind like prayers, but the rhythm would not hold. Her discipline frayed at the edges, because in this world of leaning fences and missing latches, the system still moved forward, and that terrified her more than the war ever had. But somehow, the mess hall door did swinging open with a practiced push, closing on its own with a heavy thunk that startled her the first time she heard it. Miyako stepped inside with the others, the smell hitting her like a slap. Meat, onions, something thick and salty. The room buzzed with low voices and the clatter of utensils. A line had already formed, winding past a long table where men in aprons moved like clockwork, scooping, sliding, moving trays down the line without pause. She squinted. There was no shouting, no pushing. The rhythm was unmistakable. This was not a military chow line. No one barked orders, and yet everyone was fed. She had expected chaos, maybe hoarding, maybe corruption officers getting better portions, bribes slipped in for extra sugar. That was how it worked back home. Here, a teenage private received the same ladleful of stew as a sergeant. A prisoner received the same as a guard. The bread was evenly cut, the trays balanced, the utensils clean. The efficiency struck her like a betrayal. How could something so casual operate so well? She kept watching. Each man at the food table had a role. One did nothing but ladle stew, another poured coffee, a third refilled bread baskets with movements so precise it could have been choreography. No one corrected anyone. They didn't need to. It was all muscle memory. Miyako reached the front of the line and accepted her tray with silent suspicion. The guard nodded. She looked down. A generous helping of beef stew, a hunk of bread, a piece of butter already melting, a mug of something dark and bitter-smelling. "Coffee!" She hesitated, then moved on. Back at the table, she watched. The others were already eating. No one talked, but their chewing was loud, unguarded, and oddly reverent. She dipped her spoon. The stew was thicker than anything she had tasted in months. It clung to the spoon like it meant to stay. She took a bite, and it stopped her. Salt, fat, warmth. She swallowed hard, unsure if it was the food or the shame that burned her throat. In the past, she had memorized ration schedules by heart, calculated how many grams of barley it would take to keep a soldier on his feet for another march. She knew what desperation tasted like: rice stretched with dust, broth thinned with tears. But this was abundance, and no one was hoarding it. She glanced at the guards. One was refilling trays. Another was wiping down a table. A third leaned against the wall, watching with a look that wasn't smug or suspicious, just calm. She expected tension, expected threats, but the whole process flowed without friction. Even cleanup was methodical. Buckets appeared, rags soaked, floors swept before anyone could complain. It wasn't the order of command. It was the order of habit. This wasn't the efficiency she knew. It wasn't drilled or punished into place. It wasn't powered by fear. It just existed, quiet, durable, human. That was the worst part. She caught herself before she finished the stew too quickly. She tore the bread into pieces slowly, not out of caution, but respect. Something inside her shifted, just a little, enough to notice. As she stood to return her tray, she found herself scanning the line again. Still moving, still balanced. No waste, no delay. Order without cruelty. It wasn't military, but it worked. And for the first time, Miyako didn't scoff. She studied. The next morning, she was handed her first regular chore: assist with livestock feeding. The assignment came without ceremony, just a wave from a guard and a point toward the pasture. "You'll be with Reuben," someone said, as if that meant anything to her. She walked through the dust with wary steps, unsure what kind of absurdity waited at the end of this latest task. Probably another gate that wouldn't shut. Another tool held together with wire and luck. Reuben was leaning against a fence, chewing a piece of straw and squinting into the sun. His boots were scuffed, his shirt stained, and his hat sat so low on his head it was hard to tell if he had eyes at all. In one hand, he held a clipboard. Tucked behind his ear was a pencil worn down to a stub. He looked like every cartoon of an American cowboy she'd ever imagined. She almost laughed. Then he started talking. "All right, we feed the South Pens first," he said, tapping the board. "Cattle on sweet mix today. Don't mix 'em up with the oat-fed ones, they get bloated. You'll follow my lead." He glanced at her and raised an eyebrow. "You understand English, okay?" She gave a short nod, surprised at the clarity in his tone. Not slow or mocking, just direct. Reuben gestured for her to follow, and they set off toward the barn. Inside, the air was thick with dust and feed. Sacks were labeled in English, scrawled by hand. She tried to keep up, reading what she could. Reuben moved like someone who'd done the same dance 1,000 times. Scoop, pour, mark the board, adjust the timing, move on. It was not elegant, but it was fluid. When they reached the South Pens, he started calling cattle by name: Buttercup, Daisy, Hank, Red. At first, she thought he was joking, but each name matched a face, and each face had a schedule. He fed them differently based on age, size, even temperament. One cow kicked the trough if fed late. Another refused to eat if the hay was piled wrong. Reuben knew every quirk. She asked him once, cautiously, "How many cows?" 67, he replied instantly, not counting the bull and the 2 new heifers. Miyako blinked. No list, no printouts, just memory. She had memorized troop movements and supply weights, but this was another kind of knowledge. She started to pay closer attention. He used the clipboard, yes, but more like a ritual than a crutch. The paper held scrawled columns: feed amounts, changes, medical notes. She recognized the structure. He had built a system, not for approval, not for appearance, but because the cows needed it. At one point, she asked, "Why not type this?" Reuben snorted. "Don't need to! Pencil's faster! I know what's where!" It wasn't military precision. There were no inspections, no punishments, but there was discipline, quiet, practiced, and deeply embedded. She watched him scribble a correction, mutter to himself, and then move without hesitation. No orders, no chain of command, only responsibility. By the third day, she was taking notes in Japanese, mimicking his columns, copying his shorthand. Reuben noticed, pointed at her page, and said, "Looks sharp," then added, "You want to carry the board tomorrow?" She didn't answer at first. She just nodded. That night, she lay in bed thinking not about generals or orders, but about cows, about Reuben, about how knowledge had a shape here less rigid, but no less exact. Intelligence, she realized, didn't always speak in crisp uniforms and stamped forms. Sometimes it wore denim and carried a clipboard. The next day, the tractor died. It happened in the middle of the afternoon, just as the sun turned the sky into a pale curtain of heat and shimmer. One of the younger cowboys was hauling feed from the east shed when the machine sputtered, coughed once, and then let out a metallic groan that echoed across the pasture. It wheezed to a stop beside the fence, steam rising from the hood like a white flag. Miyako heard the noise from the barn and walked out, squinting at the commotion. Reuben was already approaching, calm as ever, pencil still behind his ear. Two other men gathered around the machine. No panic, no shouting for a superior, no forms to fill out. One of them lifted the hood, shook his head, and muttered something about the radiator being cracked. Miyako stood back, arms crossed, expecting the next step, a requisition, a report, a wait. But that didn't happen. Within minutes, one cowboy disappeared into the shed and returned with a tin can. Another fished baling wire from his back pocket. Reuben crouched low, scraped something off the dirt with a twig, sniffed it, and nodded. "Still tacky," he said. Miyako watched, baffled, as they began fashioning what appeared to be a temporary patch, using tools no officer in Japan would have deemed acceptable for a field repair. They didn't wait for parts. They didn't send a message for approval. They collaborated, arguing, laughing, spitting but working in rhythm. One held the can steady, another twisted wire like a craftsman threading a needle. Someone pulled chewing gum from their mouth, rolled it flat, and used it to seal the patch with a look of total sincerity. It was absurd. And then it worked. The engine sputtered back to life, a little uneven, a little louder, but running. Miyako stood there, stunned. Back in Japan, such a repair would have taken a week of paperwork. First, a damage report, then a series of escalating authorizations. Parts would be shipped, receipts recorded, and if someone tried to improvise a solution, they'd be reprimanded or demoted. Rules were rules. The chain of command mattered more than the result. But here, result was the rule. She remembered the Tanaka table, an infamous medical inventory case back home. In Osaka, a surgical table went unused for nearly 2 months because a single bracket was missing. Bureaucracy strangled progress. The part was ordered, reordered, misplaced, and delayed, all while wounded soldiers lay on the floor. No one dared bypass the process. The table sat there, pristine and useless, while men bled around it. The tractor, however, rolled forward 10 minutes after braking. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't according to protocol, but it worked. And for the first time, she used the word efficient not in bitterness, but awe. She didn't say it aloud. She wasn't ready for that. But inside, something cracked, like the radiator, like the myths she'd carried into captivity. That order required formality. That quality required hierarchy. That low tech meant incompetence. Because what she saw wasn't incompetence. It was mastery, quiet, cooperative, flexible, built on trust and instinct, not fear. She stopped laughing at the Cowboys that day. She started watching, really watching, not for flaws, but for the logic behind the looseness, the wisdom hidden beneath the denim, the function behind the seeming mess. And in that sweat-stained field, beside a rattling machine held together by wire and willpower, Miyako realized something she never thought she would. This wasn't improvisation. It was adaptation. And once Miyako saw it that way, she couldn't stop seeing it. She began rising earlier, not because anyone told her to, but because she wanted to observe the transitions, those invisible handovers that marked the flow of the ranch. The way the night watch passed off to the morning hands with only a nod. How the kitchen began clanging precisely 15 minutes before sunrise. How buckets of oats were already waiting beside stalls before the horses even stirred. She started sketching what she saw. Scraps of paper tucked under her cot became crude diagrams. Arrows pointed toward water barrels, feed rotations, patrol paths. She used her old habits, the same ones that had mapped bomb routes and supply chains, now repurposed for pasture gates and laundry schedules. The patterns were loose, but undeniably present. Like a dance no one needed to rehearse anymore. There were no whistles, no drills, and yet no one was ever late. Miyako tracked the rotation of the meal shifts. Each group flowed through the mess hall with uncanny consistency. The men in the kitchen adapted quickly to shortages, switching from beef to beans without complaint. Someone always anticipated the change. She marked that too. Anticipation. It was not command, it was trust. At first, she assumed the guards would break the illusion that behind the kindness, they'd bark, or threaten, or remind everyone who held the guns. But they didn't. They stood where they needed to be, sure. Present, but not looming. Their presence wasn't a warning, it was a reassurance. This defied everything she had been taught. She'd grown up believing that people needed structure, fear, and rank to function. That without oversight, laziness would rule. But here, the absence of barked orders didn't result in sloth. It allowed initiative. The guards trusted the prisoners to clean their own quarters, to rotate chores, to feed animals without oversight, and the prisoners did. Miyako found herself washing troughs without being asked, not because she'd been assigned, but because they needed washing and she happened to be nearby. It wasn't obedience, it was participation. She barely recognized the feeling. In Japan, her mind had been a machine for compliance. She executed orders with flawless precision. Here, she found herself making suggestions, adjusting the angle of the feed bins so the grain didn't spill, recommending a new route to the water barrels to avoid a muddy dip. Reuben listened, even smiled. "Good thinking," he said, tapping his clipboard. She didn't know what to do with that praise. It wasn't formal, it wasn't ranked, but it felt earned. One afternoon, sitting beneath the shade of the water tower, she stared at the half-finished sketch on her lap. It was the ranch, but more than that, it was a web. No center. No single point of failure. No one man in charge. If someone was sick, someone else stepped in. If a tool broke, it was fixed. Not reported, not delayed. It was a kind of strength she had never named before. Decentralization. She remembered the warehouses back home, corridors of crates, shelves of waiting supplies, all frozen until a signature released them. Efficiency buried beneath formality. She had called it honor. Now, she wasn't so sure. This ranch wasn't built for war, but it had survived war. And it did so without uniforms, without salutes, just hands that moved when they were needed. That realization stung more than she expected, because she wasn't just witnessing competence, she was beginning to admire it. The realization unsettled her more than the heat or the dust ever had. Admiration was dangerous. Admiration led to questions, and questions led to doubt. Still, she found herself walking toward the chicken pens one morning with an unfamiliar curiosity tightening in her chest. The sound came before the sight, soft, clucking, rhythmic, almost musical. She expected chaos. Feathers everywhere, birds scattering at the slightest movement. Instead, she found order. A wooden board hung beside the coop, sun-bleached and cracked with age. On it was chalk writing, smudged but legible. Names, times, quantities, feed rotations, cleaning schedules. The handwriting varied, some neat, some sloppy, but the structure was unmistakable. Each line had been checked, erased, and rewritten, a system quietly maintained. She stared at it longer than she meant to. One of the ranch hands passed behind her carrying a bucket of grain. "Morning," he said, nodding toward the board. "You're on egg count today." She blinked. "I am?" He smiled like this was the most natural thing in the world. "You're the only one who noticed the pattern yesterday." She almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she stepped closer, reading the list again. Feed in the morning, eggs collected mid-morning, cleaning at dusk, no wasted motion, no shouting, no orders barked across a yard, just a quiet agreement written in chalk and followed because it worked. She had overseen operations with thousands of moving parts. She had memorized convoy schedules, supply quotas, ration allowances down to the gram, and yet, here she was, standing in a chicken yard, realizing that this small, humble system was more elegant than anything she had designed under pressure. The chickens moved calmly around her boots, unbothered. She crouched, watching as one laid an egg, then moved aside without fuss. She reached down and picked it up, warm in her palm. It felt absurdly important. That afternoon, she watched the process repeat. No yelling, no oversight, just people doing what needed to be done, trusting that others would do the same. The efficiency wasn't forced, it was assumed. That unsettled her more than any barking officer ever had. She found herself thinking back to the supply depots she once ran. Endless forms, endless approvals. A single error could halt everything. People were punished for initiative. Here, initiative was expected, rewarded, quietly absorbed into the rhythm of the day. Later, in the shade beside the coop, she took out a scrap of paper and began to write not instructions, not orders, but observations. How long it took to feed the hens, how often the water needed changing, how the men rotated duties without discussion. It was a map of understanding, not control. She realized then that she was no longer watching from the outside. She was participating. That realization frightened her. Because if this system worked, if cooperation without coercion produced order, then everything she had believed about strength was wrong. It meant discipline did not require fear. That authority could exist without dominance. That people could act responsibly without being watched. She thought of the training halls back home, the shouted commands, the fear of mistakes. She thought of how order had been beaten into them, not earned. how obedience had replaced trust. Here, trust came first. She looked again at the chalkboard. Someone had added a small note at the bottom, almost as an afterthought. Check water level before sundown. No signature, no rank, just responsibility. That night, lying in her bunk, she could not sleep. The image of the board stayed with her, the simplicity of it, the quiet cooperation, the unsettling truth that efficiency could grow from something as soft as trust. She had come expecting to observe incompetence. Instead, she was watching a system breathe, and for the first time since her capture, she felt the ground shift beneath her not with fear, but with the slow, undeniable sense that the world she thought she understood was built on very different rules than the ones she had been taught to obey. It happened one evening when the sun had begun to settle behind the barn, casting long shadows across the yard. Miyako was washing her hands in a metal basin near the stables when she caught a glimpse of Reuben sitting on a barrel, flipping through a worn ledger. The leather cover was faded, the pages soft from use. There was no computer screen, no organized binder, just a book, old, tattered, and somehow familiar. She watched him for a moment, curious but cautious. What would a cowboy need with a ledger? She assumed it was just more of the same scraps of information thrown together. But something about the way he held it, his concentration, caught her attention. After a long pause, Reuben looked up and caught her eye. Without a word, he slid the ledger toward her. There was no joke, no mocking, just a simple, unspoken invitation. Miyako hesitated but took the ledger from him and sat down next to him. As she began leafing through the pages, her mind churned with disbelief. It was organized painfully so. Every item on the ranch was accounted for. Hay, feed, medicine, tools, even storm repairs. Everything was listed with dates, quantities, and notes that made her realize how much care went into maintaining the ranch. This wasn't a haphazard attempt to keep things in check. This was a detailed record of every action taken. She turned a page and found a note about fixing the fence materials used, time spent, cost of wire and nails. Another page detailed the cow's medical history. The list went on water schedules, livestock feed ratios, maintenance costs. It wasn't just a log. It was a blueprint for survival. A soft laugh slipped from her, one of self-deprecation. She hadn't meant to laugh at Reuben, only at herself. She had spent days judging this place, calling it inefficient, chaotic. And here, in this small, battered book, was something more organized than any system she had ever overseen. This wasn't luck. This wasn't charm. This was order. A different kind of order, but order nonetheless. Reuben smiled, a knowing grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I take it you didn't think we had a system," he said, amusement in his voice. Miyako flushed with the quiet shame of her assumptions. "I thought it was all chaos," she admitted. "No rules, no structure, just—" She trailed off, unsure of how to explain. Reuben leaned back, his eyes never leaving her. "Might look messy, but I've learned the best way to get things done is to keep track of what's important. The rest sorts itself out." He glanced at the ledger, then back at her. "Ain't no good running a place if you don't know what you're running." Miyako closed the ledger slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. She had expected chaos. Instead, she found a system that relied on observation and trust, not force. The efficiency she had once admired, the rigid systems of control, was not what this place was about. It was something softer, yet more enduring. "I didn't understand," she said quietly. Reuben's grin widened. No need to apologize. Most folks think it's all about keeping a tight grip, but in the end, it's about knowing what needs a grip and what needs freedom. Miyako nodded, her fingers lingering on the edges of the pages. The American way wasn't so foreign after all, and for the first time, she truly believed him. If you're finding this story as surprising as she did, drop a like and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Her hand lingered above the paper, hesitant, as the quiet hum of the ranch surrounded her. Miyako had never felt this uncertainty before. The words she had written in her mind seemed simple enough, but now that she had the pen in her hand, they felt heavy, burdened by a shift she wasn't sure she could explain. It had been weeks since she had arrived, weeks since the world she knew had cracked open. The trust and order here, the way people worked together without command, had slowly eroded the judgment she had brought with her. She had tried to maintain the same cold objectivity she had once used to observe the enemy, but now she wasn't just watching, she was living it. Her pen scratched the paper, the words slow and careful as they formed. "Dear Mother, I am well. It is strange here. The Americans are not as I was told. They are not the wolves I expected. I have seen them work, and though they are different, their ways are strange, but not foolish. I cannot yet fully explain it, but I will try." She paused, rereading the lines. They felt like a betrayal. She had been trained to see them as the enemy, to judge them with unyielding certainty. But now, she found herself questioning everything. Where did the enemy end and the world begin? Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Japan is the only true way. Others are weaker. Their systems will crumble. Miyako had always believed this, had been taught to see loyalty and obedience as sacred. To question was to betray. And yet, here, she found herself questioning. How could she respect what she had once despised? Was this weakness, or was it truth? The thought of betraying her country sent a chill through her. She hadn't been prepared for this. She had expected dysfunction, but instead, she found something worthy of respect, something she didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. She stared at the paper in front of her, feeling the weight of the moment. This letter was a bridge between two worlds, between everything she had been taught and what she was beginning to understand. She wasn't sure what her family would think, or if the letter would even reach them. But she knew one thing. The truth she had seen here wasn't chaos. It was something else, something softer but undeniably strong. She picked up the pen again, more steady now, and continued. "I cannot explain it all, but I wanted you to know that I have seen their ways. They trust one another and work together without demands of power. There is no hierarchy like we have known. They call it freedom, and though I do not yet fully understand it, I cannot deny its strength. I will learn more, and I will try to understand it better." The words felt like a surrender, but not in the way she feared. It wasn't surrendering her identity, but admitting that respect could exist without submission. She didn't have to abandon her values to acknowledge the good she had found here. As she folded the letter, she realized it wasn't meant for anyone else. It was for herself, a step toward understanding. Whatever came next, she knew she had already changed. With the weight of her thoughts settled into the envelope, she placed it aside for now, knowing that the change had already begun. And for the first time, she didn't want to fix it. She simply wanted to leave it as it was. The morning of her departure was quiet, almost too quiet. Miyako stood near the truck, her bags packed and her boots heavy on the ground. The ranch had become a part of her, even if she didn't know how to say it yet. The gates, still squeaky and imperfect, stood before her, as they always had. no longer a symbol of disorder, but of something else. Something that had endured. The truck's engine rumbled to life, and Miyako climbed in, glancing back at the ranch one last time. Reuben was at the fence, still muttering softly to his horses, just as she had seen him do so many times before. The fence still leaned, the posts worn by time and weather. The barn, too, stood as crooked as ever. Yet now it felt complete in its imperfection. It was only now that she realized the ranch wasn't broken. It was alive. It had adapted, grown, and continued to function without the rigidity she had once believed was necessary. The fence creaked in its own rhythm, the horses moved at their own pace, and the world still turned without any of them needing to force it. She felt something shift inside her. The truck pulled away, and she watched the ranch grow smaller in the rearview mirror. Her reflection, framed by the glass, was unfamiliar to her. It was the same face, the same woman, but something had changed. The woman she saw now was no longer the one who had arrived weeks ago, untrusting, rigid, and sure of everything. The reflection in the mirror held someone who had learned to understand, to listen, and perhaps most startling of all, to respect. What had she learned here, in this place? The realization wasn't immediate, but as the miles passed, it became clearer. She had learned that order didn't require uniforms. That power didn't have to come from domination. Efficiency didn't demand fear. Instead, it was built from collaboration, trust, and quiet participation. It was something she had never expected to find in this strange, unpolished land. Her mind drifted back to the long hours spent washing troughs, feeding the horses, and tracking the chickens. Each task, no matter how small, had been done without anyone commanding it. People had worked because it needed to be done. They worked because they trusted one another, and in that trust, they found dignity. This was the lesson she took with her. Strength was not about control. It was about understanding how to work together. As the truck continued down the dusty road, she felt the weight of everything she had unlearned, everything she had been taught to believe, and it stung more than she expected. The rigidity of her past had held her for so long, but now it was unraveling. The comfort of control had been a shield, but here she had learned that letting go of that shield didn't mean weakness. It meant freedom. The ranch would still stand, the fence still squeak, and Reuben would still speak to his horses. But for Miyako, nothing would ever be the same. She had come here expecting to fix a broken system, but she was leaving with a completely different understanding of what strength and order truly meant. And as the ranch disappeared from view, she knew whatever came next, she would face it differently. If this story challenged your assumptions too, please like the video and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And thank you for remembering a piece of history the world nearly forgot.